IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. Just as it is every week, it's been an interesting week for tech, with TikTok coming out in the US and saying that it's going to contest the Trump administration's idea to ban it and undertaking a number of very interesting potential legal and acquisitive actions with American companies to try and fly under the radar. This brings up like a broader question in terms of how various tech companies see state societies across the world. Because as all of our listeners will know, when TikTok was banned in India, TikTok basically ran to announce to the entire Indian public that it was going to be complying with the government order. There was no talk of contesting what the government had demanded in the courts or anything of the sort. On the other hand, when Pakistan came out with a version of intermediary liability laws that would have adversely impacted social media platforms such as Facebook, a lot of these platforms basically threatened to walk out of Pakistan unless and until the Pakistan government rolled back the severity of some of these liability rules. So this brings up a series of questions in terms of how do these tech companies see various state societies? Why is it that they adopt very, very different strategies depending on the kind of institutions or polities that they attempt to be operating in? What does it tell us about the strategies and the way that they see various state societies across the world? Today, Rohan and Prateek are joining me. Hi, guys.
Yeah,
hello.
And we're going to be diving into a bunch of these different issues. So let's, of course, talk about the issue that's at the forefront, possibly the world's most infamous social media company at this point, TikTok. So what's TikTok been up to, guys?
So, diving straight into it, I think TikTok is in a very different position than any other social media company in the world. Right? It's Chinese, and that immediately puts it at a very different vantage point than, let's say, something like Facebook. The second thing also is that it's emerging in the sense that it's not already a giant like Facebook is, but at the same time, it's a very real threat. So the US has recognized this whole threat and basically said, and it's an election year for Trump, so put that in the same bucket. And they basically said that, well, if TikTok is to continue to operate in the United States, it needs to be an American company. And so they basically said that it might make sense to have Microsoft merge with TikTok. I mean, they haven't implied this, but Microsoft has considered this very seriously. Then TikTok has basically gone ahead and said that they're considering something with a merger with Twitter, which wouldn't be as much of a merger, but an acquisition, because TikTok's a bigger company than Twitter is. So that's basically going to make TikTok an American company by purchasing an American company in a sense. And the way they've gone about this in India is basically by saying that, well, we've been banned in India. And TechCrunch, I think, broke the news on this, saying that they're considering an investment by Reliance in TikTok. And that would basically give them some leverage to be active in India again. So it's just this whole strategic play that's trying to manage various stakeholders, not in the US, but in India as well. And it's just shaping up to be just this massive political crisis that's happening at hand. So we're yet to see how this will finally end in its consequences. But at the same time, right now, it's just too close to call which way it is going to go.
So you could have MicroTalk, TwikTok, or, well, GeoTalk is taken, so maybe JigTalk by the end of it.
But if any listeners are dropping out at this point, I would completely understand why they're doing that.
No, but because it is interesting because as Anirudh mentioned, right, when it happened in India, they immediately came out and said, we're complying with the government directive. But in the US, as long as there was an implied threat of this happening, their country general manager came out and said, hey, we're not going anywhere. And now, as we're recording this, there's talk of TikTok employees getting together and challenging the order because it means that they potentially may not be able to draw salaries or something of the sort, right? So it's a very different adversarial position that they seem to have taken in the US as opposed to what they did in India, right? And again, and this is not limited to TikTok, right? If we go back to the Trump travel ban, a whole bunch of tech companies at that time signed an amicus brief against it, right? Saying that this is against our values, et cetera, right? If you look at what happened with Apple and the FBI, as well, right? They were fairly adversarial against the American government at the time, and this was, I forget which shootout it was, but it was when the FBI wanted Apple to unlock a phone, right, of one of the shooters. I forget which incident it was.
Was it a nightclub?
Yes.
Florida, if I remember correctly.
I think
or California. I'm not totally sure, but yeah, I know which incident you're talking about.
Yeah. So if you look at the way they've responded to the US versus the way they responded to China, right? For example, in China, they went to the extent of setting up a whole infrastructure there because the Chinese government was mandating that everyone host content locally. Any coincidence is purely incidental at this point, but so they went into that, right? So it seems interesting. They seem to look at these countries in different ways and choose how to respond, right? Even if you talk about Black Lives Matter, right? A lot of them have come out and made statements about how this is against American values, etc. They've gone and done that. Again, coming straight back to TikTok, right? Which when the executive order came out, I think they put up a blog post, which of course we can't read. But it basically said, and I'm quoting here, that it said that it sets a dangerous precedent for the concept of free expression and open markets. And we will pursue all remedies available to us in order to ensure that the rule of law is not discarded and that our company and our users are treated fairly, if not by the administration, then by the US courts. Right. So this is what they said in the US. And if you contrast the situation with India, right, in terms of, I guess, potentially the arbitrariness of the orders and how they came out of nowhere, there wasn't too much of a difference, right? So it's interesting to see what internal calculus they would have gone through. They would have figured out and made various trade-offs to say, hey, this is how we should respond in the US versus this is how we should respond in India. Again, going back to the anti-CA protest, right? Again, I think it was only Satya Nadella who said something of the sort that this is not good in response to a very specific question, and then there was backlash, and I think Microsoft PR basically dialed back his exact words at the point, right? So, but no one else, not American companies, not Indian companies, right? None of them, if I, at least as far as I'm aware, I could be wrong, but I don't recall anyone taking a public stance against it. It was just, it was a, this is not our battle, let's not get involved sort of scenario.
There's really a lot to unpack here, and I think we can probably look at multiple kind of pairings of these companies and the kind of states they're interacting with, right? The first is American companies interacting with China. The second is Chinese companies interacting with America. Third is American companies in India, and the fourth would be Chinese companies in India. All of these, I think, provide us with some pretty interesting insights into how these thought process and strategies work, as you said, Prateek. So let's first talk about American companies in China, right? It's a matter of public record that American companies have a tendency to bend over backwards to kind of please the Chinese government and comply with their ridiculous censorship norms, while at the same time standing up for free speech in the US. What do you think is the single biggest reason for them being so willing to comply with the Chinese government? Why is it that while an American CEO might come out and say something about freedom of speech and police brutality during the Black Lives Matter movement, will say absolutely nothing about the Uyghurs? Or why is it that a Blizzard Entertainment will ban a player in one of their biggest tournaments for speaking out about something that pisses off the Chinese government, while at the same time standing up and coming out with statements supporting protesters in the US?
Yeah, so at this point, right, just a quick disclosure, because I was working for, I think between 2015 2018, I was working for one of, a CDN company, and I was handling China. So I just want to make that disclosure here. Anirudh likes to call me Chinese censor, right?
You beat me to it.
Yeah, before you got there. But no, so, again, without necessarily taking any names, right? We know which companies operate in China, which companies don't. That's the way the Chinese law is structured. So social media companies, do not, but a bunch of others still do. And, in my experience, and again, and right now I'm expanding beyond even tech companies, right? It's everyone. It's retail, commerce, everyone, right? It seemed to me, at least, that it came down to essentially the size of the market, right? That at the end of the day, China was a very lucrative market for them, and they didn't want to lose access to that market. And they knew that, you were always sort of operating under that, with the sword of Damocles hanging over your head. in China, right? One misstep can lead you to being blocked and kicked out of the country. There was precedent of that happening, and the Great Firewall, as it's called, it also had the technical capability to sort of do that, right? Of course, there are ways around it, VPNs, etc. But it is, once you get blacklisted, you do take a hit, right? So at least in my mind, it came down to the size of the market, right? Because there are a lot of examples. It's not just American companies, right? Even Audi, I think, when they came out with an ad where they used a Dalai Lama quote, there was a lot of outrage on Chinese social media, and then the company basically came out and apologized. And this is well before the NBA incident, etc. Right? I think the NBA one was when you really saw a mass export of this censorship model, but it's been happening through the years, right? Various hotel chains, airlines, all of them at various points in time have had to apologize for either listing Taiwan as a separate country, Hong Kong as a separate country, or sometimes Tibet as a separate country. And depending on which one you listed as a separate country, the government would respond at different scales. If I remember, I think they got the reaction was it was the strongest when you listed Tibet as a separate country. Hong Kong, I think, there was a lot of threatening, but they didn't actually block you for Hong Kong. They just made you apologize. And Taiwan was somewhere in the middle. But yeah, it was really interesting to see how they all sort of operated within this censorship regime.
What is most striking to me is how, as you said, that this fear of the sword of Damocles, namely the fear of some kind of backlash from the Chinese government, when you don't really have levers of your own to kind of push and nudge and lobby within the government, can lead these companies to adopt an extremely cautious stance. Whereas it seems to me that in the US, because there is a very long precedent of companies lobbying the government, of courts taking out decisions that don't necessarily agree with the government's foreign policy, there seems to be a lot more wriggle room for companies to kind of say stuff that they think is more politically astute. That's more what their actual audiences demand. So for them, the trade-off is no longer about keeping the government happy, but more about actually keeping their audiences happy and making sure their audiences hear what they expect to hear, namely support for popular movements and so on.
Yeah, I think so, right? But again, in the China case, right, it wasn't always that there was overt government action as well. Sometimes it was in response to just social media outrage, right? And again, we've seen that happen in India countless number of times, right? Again, the most famous example, I think, goes back to Amazon Canada, I think, right? Where some seller had listed a slipper that had an Indian god on it.
Yeah. It was a Ganesha.
Then External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj basically said that, hey, we'll revoke all your visas, right? And I think Amazon took some action. Again, being a third-party seller, the amount of action they could have taken was limited. I think at most what they could have done was just block that seller for then. But again, right? What was the basis on which someone threatened to withdraw issued visas, right? Completely arbitrary threat, right? And they basically complied. And, it was accompanied by a lot of outrage on Twitter as well, right? Our local outrage machine. And again, that isn't the only time, right? I think over the years, number of times different companies have faced social media outrage. Sometimes I think it happened with Snapchat. It happened with, I think, unfortunately, Snapdeal being mistaken for Snapchat. We've had a whole bunch of issues of that sort as well. So sometimes, they're playing both to the government and to the audience in those countries as well.
Can I just add here that the benchmark for me for companies pandering to countries, specifically China, is Google, because in the initial days, I'm not sure if you remember, and I definitely don't. I read a lot about this, but Google basically gave up its position in China because they had tried to bend over backwards and a bunch of things did not work out, right? The company culture did not match, censorship demands were getting to be too much. Google had this whole self-fulfilling prophecy of just being, too holy or too good that did not set in well with China. And that to me stands in stark contrast to what Apple did, because Apple continues to bend over backwards for China by placing their servers there, compromising on how much privacy it affords to its users, and also at one point in time actually actively removing a Maps app that was helping Hong Kong protesters organize better. So a bunch, as Prateek said, a bunch of things come together to make this decision. These are complex calls that are taken by companies. But I also think one of the major deciding factors that what's at stake here. Because companies will even also, let's say, pull out of the US, American companies. Recently, we got news that Uber was considering moving out of San Francisco, if I'm not wrong, because the San Francisco was looking at a law that would make sure that Uber contractors are specified as employees under the law, and then Uber would have essentially pay people who are working at Uber full time. So that was clearly too much of Uber's business model to handle, so they've threatened to pull out. Not sure that will happen yet, but it's a very real threat to have. So I think
I was just going to add, right? In Google's case, I think again, no one has overtly said this, but it does seem like they regretted that option. Again, this is judgment on my part, right? This is opinion, and some of it is strengthened by the fact that they were working on, in quote, secret project, and once that got leaked and there was a lot of employee backlash, they shelved that. Even in that scenario, it seems like at some point they might have reached a compromise with China in the last couple of years. But yeah, the Uber example is pretty interesting. I think it's a California-wide law. I could be wrong, and I think Lyft has also joined in with Uber on that, saying that they may have to suspend services in California if that law comes through. I'm not aware of the specific details, so I won't say more than this because it'll be absolute speculation. But again, that's actually a very different consideration, right? It's not one where they're necessarily pandering to public opinion in large. I think in that case, it's a purely self-preservation kind of call that they've taken.
And on the other end, you have basically Pakistan, I think, coming up with their own intermediary guidelines. And then what was that, Prateek? Could you expand on that? The Asia Coalition?
The Asia Internet Coalition, right? Which was essentially a consortium of all these big tech guys. They
said that these intermediary liability rules, we don't stand with them, and actively threatened to walk out, if I'm not wrong.
No, so they didn't actively threaten. I think they were more diplomatic than that. So there was a lot of this is bad for the digital industry in Pakistan, which seems to contradict what the government has said. A few paragraphs of that, and then they slipped in a sentence that if these rules as they are drafted come into effect, then continuing services for users in China might be untenable or something of sort. I don't recall the exact words, but it wasn't an active threat that that hey, if these rules come in, we'll walk out. They basically said if these rules come in, it's going to be very difficult for us to serve users in Pakistan.
Okay, fine. We'll meet in the middle. Call it a passive threat.
Yeah. It was definitely a threat, right? There was no doubt that. The signaling of the entire exercise, right? A bunch of companies coming together, writing an open letter. No doubt it was a threat. It was just a very diplomatic.
So that again is interesting because clearly they didn't really care what the audience in Pakistan wanted to hear. They knew perfectly well that if they were to threaten to take their business elsewhere, the Pakistan government would have no option but to back away. And so they felt emboldened enough to actually basically arm twist a sovereign entity into backing down.
It's actually interesting. Sorry to cut you off, right? But as we're recording this, there's actually something very interesting that's happening on Twitter related to Pakistan. Last couple of days, there have been attempts to get a hashtag going, which is get Twitter office in Pakistan. And the reason behind this is, and I think this goes back to August last year, where about 200 accounts from Pakistan were suspended for various messages that they posted about Kashmir right after India changed Article 370, right? After they essentially diluted Article 370. 200 accounts were blocked. And since there have been frequent accusations that Twitter is pro-India, and somehow it seems to have come up again in the last week or so. I didn't find any news reports of another 200 accounts being blocked. So it seems like they're referring back to the year-old incident. But again, some of the tweets seem to indicate that it was recent. But the logic is that, hey, if we get a Twitter office in Pakistan, then we can force the company to be neutral.
Okay, so this again brings me to the flip side of this. I mean, the fact that you mentioned that Pakistanis are accusing Twitter of having a pro-India bias is, I think, quite interesting, especially given the way that the debate around misinformation and election interference works, right? Twitter, Facebook, a lot of social media companies have gone out of their way to assure Americans that they will be tackling Russian misinformation, they will be cracking down on some kinds of fake news and so on. And at all costs, the integrity of the American election is going to be maintained. but you don't necessarily see that much of a commitment to possibly the world's breeding ground of fake news and election-related disinformation, namely India. So why this kind of dissonance? Why is it that in both ostensibly democratic and free societies, these social media companies are more comfortable going against the government in one, but much more interested in towing the government line in another?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, right? And part of it is to do with the fact that, again, the problem in India, while Twitter is a place for a lot of tactical action seem to happen, right? Day-to-day hashtags, etc. But a lot of it is WhatsApp driven, right? I think Facebook and Twitter are unfortunately not a very big part of they are a big part of the disinformation ecosystem, but they're not the largest part of the disinformation ecosystem by any stretch, right? And I think that's and because it's WhatsApp and because this is encrypted and hidden, while there is awareness of this, it's not something that we've been able to hold them to account as much as they're willing to hold themselves to account in the US as well, right? Yeah, it's an interesting one. We can only speculate on what basis they've made these sort of calls. But again, if I remember, before the last set of Lok Sabha election, the Election Commission did come out with guidelines for social media, and all of them basically said that they will comply, right? But yeah, this goes back to a point I think that we've discussed very often is that a lot of their focus is still very US and Western European, right? Even if you look at, for example, they do a periodic community standards report, right, as part of their transparency exercise. I'm talking about Facebook. There's no country breakdown for that, right? So that, okay, Facebook took down X million pieces of content, but it tells me nothing other than the fact that X% was removed for being hate speech, Y% was removed for being child sexual abuse material, but it doesn't tell me how much is happening in India, how much is happening in the US, how much is happening in different countries, right? So there is that overall sense that they're still only accountable to the US, which is their primary market, at least from a revenue point, and where they are generally incorporated, unless you count the fact that for tax reasons a lot of them are headquartered in Ireland. But yeah, it seems like a lot of it comes from a very US centric and Western European centric approach, and I think we have to keep pushing them to be more accountable in markets like India, especially as you said, for a lot of these companies we have the largest number of users.
Yeah, so one thing I think I would like to add in the TikTok incident is that I have a feeling this is going to go on for a long time, at least as long as the India-China face-off continues to be a thing, and likelihood probably after that. So it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. Right now, I don't see an end date for that, which is why I think TikTok is likely going with lines as an investor. So to basically say that, maybe this is something that's going to bring the end date closer to TikTok being reinstated in India. So let's see how that works out. So yeah, that's all I had on TikTok.
Okay, so we've gone over a number of interesting use cases, and I think we've managed to get some insights into the way that a lot of these companies make these cost-benefit calculations. But before we wrap up, any final thoughts from you guys?
Yeah, I think, the only thing that I'm unfortunately not going to end this on an optimistic note, as we try to do sometimes, but these sort of trade-offs are going to increase, right? Different countries are going to try and enforce their own set of, I'm going to say this in quotes, set of values on the internet. And I think, we've seen over the last couple of years, we've seen a very, very dramatic turn towards the more authoritarian model, right? Especially with the US now talking about a clean internet, right? So, the so-called flag bearer of an open internet is also talking about carving out internet infrastructure. So it's going to be interesting to see how long before we actually have some sort of replication of borders on the internet. At this point, I want to add that I've trademarked the name Naya BharatNet.
Wait, you haven't trademarked the name Naya BharatNet?
I can lie about it.
Okay, fine. Okay, I just want to build on that a little bit and say that, well, yes, the US has been talking about, let's say, the beginnings of a internet. I don't know how that's going to end. What this tells me basically is that tech in all its parts is now being used to carry out a form of geopolitics, not just by countries, but also a little bit by companies. And I think this makes for a very uncomfortable future for the internet, for tech. So on a slightly lesser optimistic note than Prateek, I don't think we're in for good times as far as tech is concerned. So yeah, that's all I had.
Yes, by far, I think one of the most important developments of the 21st century is the reemergence of these transnational corporations that can go about looting and colonizing digital spaces as they once did physical spaces. On that extremely optimistic note, thank both of you for joining me, and thank you for listening to All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. So it's been a really fun week on the network. Please do definitely check out all the regular shows that you do. But in addition, let me give you a few recommendations. On Agla Station Adulthood, Ritasha and Ayushi talk siblings. Really fun episode. I think you'll enjoy that. Nishad Pai Vaidya is on Cyrus and they discuss cricket and a lot of different things around cricket. I think you'll enjoy that as well. Old friend Parmesh Shahani, he was on Absolutely Right. Definitely do check that out. Tamal Mills was on Edges and Sledges, another episode which I've heard really good things about. I haven't heard it yet. I need to listen to that soon. And guys, Uncle Please Sit, definitely listen to that. They've been killing it. This week they have Abby Phillips, he's a doctor talking about medical misinformation. Last week Paramita Vora was talking about sex education and who needs it. They've been really killing it. Definitely do check that out. And with that, hope to see you again next week.
Entertainment is like food for the brain. It's a window to culture and a great way to understand the world around us. The internet has changed what it means to be an entertainer, creating new storytellers with millions of fans. It has spawned a new breed, the story sellers, those behind the scenes creating the business for this ecosystem. They work with brands, platforms and channels who are keen to capitalize on an audience hungrier than ever for more stories. I'm Vineet Kanabar and I have a ringside view to how stories are told and sold. On my show, I bring you creators, artists, executives and marketers for a freewheeling conversation around the business of entertainment. Tune in to Storytellers and Story Sellers for personal stories, analysis and criticism every Thursdays as I talk to the brightest minds telling or selling great stories today.